moving into the main session of the day from Mr. Kadyamadare. Mr. Kadyamadare, are you ready?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, Tshona. Thank you very much, Tim, for providing everyone with an opportunity for us to discuss this important topic on how to approach environmental management during shutdowns. So I think before we start, I'll just give a brief introduction of myself. You have already heard the name, Tendai Kadyamadare. If you can't pronounce the surname, you can just call me Tendai, it's fine. It's enough. This session is not really meant to provide technical solutions in terms of how to manage the environment during environmental issues during shutdowns. It's just meant to provoke some thinking on how organizations could approach environmental issues when they are carrying out shutdowns. The discussion will attempt to provide, a process approach or process approaches that organizations can use. And having said that, I will give a bit of context to the discussion in terms of where I'm coming from. So my profession has always been safety, health, and environment. And this dates back to probably around 1995 when I started college. And my first job was in a regulatory authority organization. So it was more on compliance enforcement, both in public and private sector. And later on, I joined some oil companies in Zimbabwe, in HSC department. Unfortunately, the oil companies don't exist in Zimbabwe anymore. But the reason why I'm giving you this is not that you get to know my profile, but so that when we start to discuss, you understand where I'm coming from in terms of the context of the discussion. At the time, I was also working as a subcontracted auditor for one of the auditing companies in Zimbabwe, auditing on quality management systems, health and safety management systems, and environmental management systems. A job that I carried over to South Africa back around 2008, mainly auditing oil and gas industries, petrochemical industries, other chemical industries, mining industries, and other manufacturing companies, including iron and steel companies. Later on, I also worked for a contractor company or a service provider where we were providing a service to oil companies. So we're transporting fuels, gas, and other chemicals. Later on, I had an opportunity to go to the Middle East where I worked in consulting in HSC in oil and gas industry. And at some point around 2015, I joined the client that we were consulting for, still in HSC. So I'm giving you this background so that when I start to talk about my experiences about managing environmental issues during shutdown, at least you can see where I am coming from. Okay, so I think we have already discussed in terms of the background context, but I will also tell you about what I have observed over these past, I don't know how to calculate the years, but I think it's about more than 20 years that I've been involved in these things. So my industry observations over the years is that I've seen a lot of companies that say that they have integrated health, safety, environmental, and quality sometimes management systems. Some of the organizations, they do it very well. But some of the organizations, what I have noticed is that they focus more on the safety aspects, like the occupational safety. Although they call their systems SHE management systems or HSC management systems, sometimes you find that the health and the environmental aspects pretty much in the background. They are not as prominent as the occupational safety side. I'm telling you this so that when we get to the shutdown issues, you get to understand what we are talking about. I've also noticed that during my auditing experience, I was just going through yesterday all the audit findings that I have made in terms of non-conformances or opportunities for improvement. About 10% of them, they actually came from environmental issues or environmental non-conformances during shutdown or after shutdown, the post-shutdown impacts related to environmental management. So it's very important that we kind of focus on environmental issues during shutdown, because from my experience, it has already shown that we are having negative outcomes through our failure to manage environmental issues during the course of work. And but why are we concerned? Why should we be concerned about managing environmental issues during shutdowns? Firstly, I think we need to understand that shutdowns are not part of the normal operations. These come, once in a while, in terms of the organization's programs. Why should we be concerned about managing environmental issues during shutdowns and any other time for that matter? I think organizations, they have moral obligations to ensure that we safeguard the environment. In other organizations, they have what they call responsible care management systems, which covers most of the issues actually pertain to environmental management. There's pollution prevention, there's emergency preparedness. There are a number of requirements in that standard that pertain to environmental management, in addition to other requirements like product stewardship and process safety. There's also legal and other requirements or legal obligations which are linked to also to our license to operate, because obviously if we breach environmental legal requirements, we are also compromising on our license to operate as organizations. So that is important. Sometimes there are also hidden costs. I remember I attended one of these sessions, I think about 2 weeks ago, where the presenter was talking about the shutdown in terms of occupational safety. And at some point, someone contributed saying that there are costs that are related to shutdowns, definitely. But what we could be worried about are those hidden costs that are related to environmental management. So this is also why it's important for us to take environmental issues into consideration when we plan for shutdowns. So the hidden costs may be related to to higher process treatment costs, like when you I'll give an example of the chemical or petrochemical industries. When you have to do shutdown, sometimes we have to clear the vessels. For you to do that, you may have to flush with water, and at the end, you have a lot of effluent that your processes don't normally handle. So you may need additional capacity to process that effluent. You may need additional chemicals, or you may need additional storage facilities. So all these come with costs. And if you don't plan in advance, this might actually escalate your cost in terms of what you had planned for the shutdown. So it's important. The same with even solid waste. You generate a lot of solid waste during shutdowns. There will be hidden costs related to the storage or even the disposal of it. So organizations need to consider, those issues when they are planning for shutdowns. There could also be consequences if we don't manage environmental issues, adequately during shutdowns. This may be in the form of fines, penalties for license breaches, and bad publicity. It depends what kind of impact you have made on the environment. You may actually damage the reputation of an organization beyond repair, which will be difficult to redress. So it's essentially important that organizations consider environmental issues when planning for the same way or the same effort that they give when we talk about occupational safety. We should probably be considering to give the same priority to environmental issues. Okay, so is there any comment or questions before we proceed? Or do you want to keep that to the end of the presentation? How do you want to handle it?
I guess it's up to you, but I just have one question
Yes,
that
sir.
I'd like to ask. You highlighted that in any integrated safety management system in most of the companies, safety has been the most prominent issue that has been managed. So how have you been? What has been your approach to ensure that balance is being struck between safety, environment, and health management?
All right. Okay. So look, what I said actually was some of the organizations, they are, implementing these management systems equally effectively across the board. But some, yes, it's there. If you read their management system manuals, some organizations have manuals. On paper, it's there. But when you go on the ground, practically, okay, examples, you go through toolbox talk meetings. The only things that they talk about there is safety. You go to what they call SHE meetings, 95% they are talking about occupational safety. But it's not everyone, okay? So I'm using my experience that I've seen through auditing and through working for different organizations to have observed these things. Normally, you ask the question, so what has been done? So it depends on the role that you are playing for at that time. So for example, if I'm auditing and ISO 14001, which is an environmental management system standard, is part of the scope. If there are shortcomings, obviously we raise them. If I'm consulting, we also advise clients, to ensure that it's actually implemented on the ground, not only on paper. And where I work, I always make sure that all those things are covered. So it depends. It depends on the hat that you are wearing on the day, the approach that you take. But I think as practitioners and as professionals, it's everyone's responsibility to ensure that these things are covered. Sometimes it's because leadership doesn't take the responsibility. Sometimes it's probably because we don't have the right competencies to implement all the standards, effectively. So there could be a lot of reasons, and I'm not going to give any of them now. I mean, we can propose and we can look at it. It depends on the organization. So, there are various factors that lead to, health and environmental issues not being effectively implemented in other organizations, not all organizations. Okay.
Okay, yeah, true.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. So I think earlier on, I gave a few examples on shutdown issues related to the petrochemical industry. My presentation, most of these examples that I'll give you are actually based on environmental issues related to petrochemical industries and oil and gas, because this is where I've spent most of my time. But obviously, it depends on the organization. Not all the issues are going to be the same. So it depends on the nature of your organization, what kind of business do you do, and what type of risks do you face. Okay. Just let me know if you are still following me on the slides, if we are still on the same slides.
Yes, we are.
Okay. So the next thing that we are going to discuss now is, what are the issues in terms of shutdowns. And the example that I'm going to give, like I said, it's coming from oil and gas and petrochemical industries. As you can see from these pictures, they don't look nice, right?
Yeah, they don't.
They don't really look nice, eh?
True.
So I think what we can see here, obviously, there could be issues with air pollution. There could be issues with land pollution. There could be issues with water pollution. And in the center there, you see a heap. This is a picture that I got from one of the organizations just after shutdown. It actually is part of what they removed from their process equipment, which consists of catalysts, spent catalysts. Because in the oil and gas industry, petrochemical industry, there is a lot of use of petrochemicals for the processes. So once you do shut down, you might have to replace the catalysts. And then what do you do with the spent catalyst? So that has been a big challenge in the oil and gas and petrochemical industries, and probably other process industries as well. So just to give a quick overview on common environmental aspects in the industry, as we have already seen from the pictures, air emissions, SOx, nitrogen oxides, methane, hydrogen sulfide, there could be plenty more. Hydrocarbons, we may have spillages, leakages, and this is especially so during shutdowns because you bring in equipment, you have to drain vessels, and in the process, you might have leakages, you might have spillages. I think in your housekeeping presentation, you mentioned a lot about waste generation. This is also something that organizations should be aware of, especially during shutdowns, because this is not the normal waste that you normally get on a daily basis, because some of it will be generated during your processes between shutdowns. And whatever you might have put into the process might not exactly be what you get when you make the equipment safe. You remove, sludge, which may contain hazardous substances. There may be radioactive material. We have already talked about spent catalysts, and you may have used chemical containers and a whole lot of other hazardous wastes. Obviously effluent, like I said, sometimes you have to make sure that the vessels are safe. So what you do, part of the process for making the equipment safe, you might have to drain them, and doing that will generate a lot of effluent from the process. And after the shutdown, normally when you do startups, you use more energy than you normally do. So that's part of another environmental aspect that organizations need to be aware of. And I've already mentioned the use of water. Obviously, you use water mostly in these processes. You use process water on a daily basis. But during shutdown, you might find out that the volume of water that you use might actually go up. So these are some of the issues that organizations may need to consider when they do shutdowns. Okay, so like I said, the aim of this discussion is not to give technical solutions on how to manage the environmental aspects, but rather to provide a wide range of approaches that organizations could use. And organizations are free to use any approach that they use, as long as we ensure that we have captured all the issues and we have assessed the risk and we have adequate controls in place to manage those risks. So that's why we wrote here that there are many approaches that organizations could consider, but it depends on the organization's nature of business, size, complexity, and risk. And some of the approaches that organizations could use, or that I've seen in industry, some organizations actually include environmental management in their shutdown philosophies. So this is done way in advance, like when you do design plans. by the time that they design, already they have a shutdown philosophy, which encompasses all the aspects related to shutdown, from maintenance to occupational safety, process safety, environmental issues, and other related issues. Some organizations, they have what they call shutdown management systems. And in those shutdown management systems, environmental management also is part of that. And that helps them, because when shutdowns come, they have to make sure that they meet all the requirements of their shutdown management system. You could also apply international standards for environmental management, for example, ISO 14001. And on ISO 14001, so what I've noticed is that sometimes when you mention these international standards, not a lot of people welcome the use of these standards or the application of these standards. But it's understandable. Sometimes people say that these are complicated, or they will make people uncomfortable. It brings a lot of work. It's understandable that people say that. But normally when people say that, there are a number of reasons why people say that. It's probably because they've worked in an organization where these systems were not effectively implemented or implemented with efficiency. So probably there was a lot of work or paperwork related to that. In some instances, people have not been exposed to these systems. So they just have this fear. So they don't want to hear about it. But on the contrary, actually, these systems, they actually help us to have frameworks to ensure that we manage our activities in a consistent manner. And for me, they actually simplify things. So it depends how you interpret the requirements of the standards, and the kind of awareness and knowledge amongst the people that are going to implement, which includes employees and service providers or contractors. So yes, anyone can use ISO 14000. You don't necessarily have to be certified for you to use them. The standards are available, you can buy them, and you can actually implement. You can implement wholly, or you can implement part of the standard if you're not going to be certified. So so that's why I say there are a lot of approaches that organizations can use. So in this presentation, I've made some examples on how we can use ISO 14000 ISO 14001 to manage our shutdown activities. Okay, so let's just quickly go to. So here I've just put what we call a high-level structure of the ISO 14001 environmental management standard. So have a look at, we are going to have a shutdown. What are the things that we are going to consider? I think we heard from the other speakers previously when talking about shutdowns that the most important thing when you're doing shutdowns is you have to understand your scope. What are the things that you are going to do? So the same way you are going to do it for environmental management. So you're going to break down your activities, and you're going to scope the shutdown. And during scoping, this is where you're going to see, okay, these activities might have an impact on the environment. It could be positive impact or it could be negative impact, but it's during scoping that you are going to understand that. And also during scoping, you have to define the context of the shutdown in terms of what are the issues that we have to consider. Could these issues be internal? Could they be external? Example of external issues could be if there's going to be air emissions that are outside your licensing limits. You might have issues with regulatory authorities. So legal issues could be an example of those external issues. Internal issues, you're going to deal with contractors and other employees. Are they aware that you're going to do shutdowns? What are the impacts in terms of safety, health, and environment? You also have to identify your interested parties. What are their needs and expectations? We've already identified some of them in this discussion. We talked about regulatory authorities. It's important that we do that so that we don't firefight when there is an incident, or when we go out of specifications related to legal requirements. Interested parties could also be, like I said, contractors, because mostly when you do shutdowns, you work with a lot of contractors, or some organizations call them service providers. So it's important. But having identified interested parties and these issues, we also need to say, so what are the risks that are associated with these issues, and what are the opportunities that we can tap in, from these issues? So it's entirely important. And once you identify your risks and opportunities, you then need to develop actions on how to address them. There was a question here about if environmental issues are not considered a lot in SHE management systems or HSC management system, what do we do? And I talked about leadership. So leadership is very important. You find that like sometimes during shutdown, the absence of leadership might actually have a negative impact on managing areas like environmental management. Why? Because you need to have someone who takes responsibility. So for example, if we are going to generate a lot of hazardous waste, who is going to be responsible for managing it? If it comes with extra cost, is the leadership prepared to support it in terms of giving, so sometimes you might need additional finances to finance handling hazardous waste. So is leadership committed? So all those things, they need to be clarified upfront. I've said here responsibilities, especially with service providers. That is very important. I'll give you an example of what I've seen previously. The main client was working with their service providers during shutdown. And there was a lot of hazardous waste that was generated. But because there was a lack of clarity in terms of responsibilities, one of the service providers, they actually thought because they had done the work, it was their responsibility to remove the waste from site. They did that, but unfortunately, they didn't dispose of it in an appropriate manner in terms of legal requirements. And unfortunately, there was an issue with the local authorities. And eventually, the responsibility came back to the organization. And when the investigation was done, yes, there were a lot of loopholes. Like, for example, how did the waste leave the site? The security didn't check. They were just told, yeah, it's part of the shutdown waste that we are removing from site by the contractor. There were no processes to manage the movement of waste from site to landfills. But unfortunately, the company or the main client, they had to take the responsibility, because the investigation revealed that there were a lot of system errors or system gaps that led to that incident. But unfortunately, at that time, your reputation with the local authorities would have been kind of damaged, because it would appear like it was deliberate, but it was not. So it's very important that we clarify roles and responsibilities, who does what, at what time, and who has authority to do what. One of the clauses in ISO 14001 is also on planning. So like I said, from your scoping, that's where you identify your environmental aspects and you assess the risk related to those aspects, and you come up with controls. These are things that if you are implementing the ISO 14001 standard, you must be doing every day. But like I said, here we are looking specifically at a shutdown activity, something that does not happen on a day-to-day basis. So it's like more of a non-routine activity. So we have to play a bit of more focus on that. We also have to make sure that the processes are adequately supported in terms of resources, awareness. We need to make sure that the people that are doing our work, they are competent. They are aware of the consequences of diverting from the environmental management principles that are in place. Issues around communication, they are also very important. I can give an example. It's quite recent on the issue of resources. It's a shutdown that I was involved in. It's quite recent, I think early this year. So what happened is that one of the contractors, they were supposed to provide what we call vacuum tankers to remove some hydrocarbons from one of the vessels or from a number of vessels. So in order for you to do that, these vacuum tankers, they are specialized vehicles. So you cannot just use any vehicle. They have to meet certain specifications because of the risks involved in terms of public safety, because they will be transporting the hydrocarbons from the site to disposal sites. So it's important that these vehicles meet certain specifications. Firstly, for the health and safety of employees and contractors, for environmental management issues, because if they are not built according to spec, or if they are not maintained according to spec, you might end up having spillages along the way, which will result in environmental issues. And then, like I said, also public safety issues, because when they transport, they use public roads. So if you are going to have an incident along the way, you might actually cause public safety issues. So what happened is that this organization, this contractor organization, they said, yes, we have the equipment. And actually they brought the equipment. But on inspection, on final inspection, it was realized that actually these tankers, they didn't meet the specifications. And you can imagine in a shutdown, there's no time. So everything has to happen according to the sequence that has been put in place in advance. So if you cannot remove those hydrocarbons, you cannot go ahead with the next process. Maybe you want to unbolt, or you want to remove flanges, you want to remove certain components. You cannot do that because the vessels are not yet safe. So the risk there is that in other organizations, some people might end up taking risks. They might say, no, we can use these trucks, they're fine. They'll take risks. Because why? Because the shutdown manager, they just want to meet their deadlines. So that's the kind of risks that you introduce. So we need to ensure that, when we talk about resources, we look at everything and we verify in advance that the resources that we have are adequate and they can do the job that they're supposed to do. They are reliable and they will be available when they are required. So unfortunately, that hiccup delayed the shutdown process by a day or two, because there was nothing else that could be done unless people decided to take shortcuts, which, like I said, is very risky to do that. Communication is also important. Like I said, if you are dealing with interested parties, you need to communicate the right information to them. And you need to identify who is going to do the communication and what kind of communication do you communicate internally and externally. So that's very important. Like here, for example, I'm sitting here with an example of a letter that was written to some department in South Africa by one of the organizations when they were about to do a shutdown. The letter was generally informing the regulatory authorities that we're going to have a shutdown from 1 June to 12 July. And we expect that we might have spikes in our emissions from a nitric acid plant and the other related plants. So they were telling them that we know that we might actually go above the license requirements. And when we do that, we are going to inform you, and we are going to take all the necessary measures to ensure that we try not to. But if it happens, just be aware that we are going to be having a shutdown. This will be the reason. So it helps. It's not like to say, yes, we are going to pollute, so it's fine. But at least it's ensuring that all the interested parties are aware of the situation that you are in, and you have processes in place to ensure that the impacts are mitigated. Okay, so when we go to operation, which is another clause in ISO 14001, this is more of your day-to-day operations. Like I said, you also talked about housekeeping. This essentially is, also part of that operational controls to make sure that when you start, the shutdown, when the shutdown is in process? Do we have controls to ensure that we don't harm people and we don't harm the environment during the course of shutdown? All right. And emergency preparedness and response is also part of operational controls. I think there has already been a presentation on emergency preparedness and response from previous weeks in these sessions. So I'm not going to go into detail with that. And at some point, you also need to have assurance activities. So you need to make sure that everything that you have planned is working according to, you know, how you have planned it. And the results that you are getting are meeting the objectives of your earlier plans. So it's important that you do that. There are a number of ways that you can do it. You can do internal audits. Some people do, you know, like walkabouts. It's also part of assurance by leadership. So it's entirely up to organizations how they want to do it. But the main important thing is to ensure that what we planned for is what is being executed, and the results that we are getting are matching what we intended to achieve. So that is very important. And on improvement issues, it's also important that whenever there's an incident related to environmental issues, these incidents are reported immediately and they are investigated just like you investigate any other day-to-day incidents that we have outside shutdown. I told you earlier on that I was going through some of the findings that I've raised during my auditing career, and some of them were related to shutdowns. Actually, two of them were on incident management. So there were environmental incidents that occurred during shutdowns, but for some reasons, these were not handled according to the organization's incident management processes. And there were reasons for that. Because some people thought, yeah, because we're in shutdown, we just manage it like as an isolated incident. But no, it doesn't work that way. So you need to make sure that if you have environmental incidents, they are reported, they're investigated, and if there are any lessons learned, they are applied. Okay. And it's also as part of improvement, once shutdowns, we've finished shutdowns, we probably have done startups. We need to go back and sit and see what are the lessons that we have learned from this shutdown, not only from an environmental management perspective, but from all aspects of the business. But the emphasis for this session is on environmental management. So I would say, I know a lot of organizations, they do that. They go through the process, how they planned, how they executed, and how they went back to normal operations, and they come up with lessons learned. But if you look at those lessons learned, very few pertain to environmental management. You'll see a lot of safety lessons, but you'll see very few, if any, on environmental issues. Okay, so just rounding up in terms of conclusion, the idea is that we need to think and see the big picture. What do we mean by this? I said I'm giving an example of petrochemical and chemical industries, oil and gas. So when we design, during process designs, we need to ensure that we take into account potential environmental issues, so that when we come to shutdowns, we are not caught by surprise. We know already that when we procured these raw materials, this is how they were going to be processed. And when they come to the end of life or during shutdowns, when we remove them from the processes, these are the kind of environmental hazards that we will face. And this is how we are going to manage them. And this also helps. We are talking here of life cycle assessment perspective. This also helps because sometimes during even procurement, you may find that you would rather procure raw material A over raw material B because of potential environmental consequences or aspects and impacts when it comes to end of life. So these are the things that probably organizations should start to think about now. So we don't just procure. We need to have that life cycle assessment perspective. What are we going to do about it when it comes to end of life? Okay. We should also always look for opportunities. Sometimes what we call waste is not really waste. It can actually be a valuable input into another organization's process. So we should look to reuse, or we should have our research and development guys to always look at opportunities. Who else could need what we call waste? It probably could be an input, an important input into someone else's processes. If we can recycle, the better. Like I said, remember earlier on, we talked about generating a lot of effluent during shutdowns because of additional processed water that is used. There could also be ways of recycling and then reusing if it's water for other processes. But it depends, like I said, it depends on the organizations, because these examples that I'm giving, they may not be applicable to all organizations. But it's the thinking that we are mostly concerned about today. So we need to apply our minds when we have shutdowns in terms of environmental management. So it's also important for organizations to ensure that we have effective integration and implementation of management systems, not just to implement some aspects of an integrated management system. We need to ensure that all aspects are covered effectively. Like I said earlier on, some organizations, they have shutdown management systems that incorporate all aspects of the business, environmental management included. Okay, thank you very much. I've just come to the end of my presentation. So I think I will leave it to you guys for questions and discussions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that insightful presentation, Mr. Tendai. It's Fungai here. And I just wanted to ask, is it common practice to have a line item in the budget to address issues around housekeeping or handling environmental aspects of a shutdown?
I don't know if we could call it a normal practice, but remember, we also, when we talked about resources, so these are the kind of things that we'll be looking at. And like I said, also it depends on the nature of the business and the risks involved, because you also don't want to overkill. So in other organizations, definitely it could be necessary to do that, because if you don't do that, you might end up with costs that you had not planned for in other organizations, because they generate quite a lot of hazardous waste and all these things, additional volumes that you don't normally do. So you could do that as part of shutdown, or if you know that if you do your budgets, for example, for that year, and you know that in this coming year, in this coming financial year, we are going to be doing shutdown for plant A, plant B, and plant C. What will be required? So that's why these processes, they're actually interdisciplinary. So you cannot just do it on your own. So it's interdisciplinary because you need to check then with the process owners when you're going to do the shutdown and what kind of costs are expected. So you need to plan in advance. So that's why we always say that, it's shutdown, yes, it will happen at some point, but you need to plan in advance. And when we talk about planning, we need to look at all aspects. And that's why we are emphasizing on these environmental issues to be considered, because from my examples and other examples that I didn't share today, it has been clear that environmental issues were not considered during planning. And then, at the end of the day, people just get okay? And sometimes when you have additional costs that are related to processing waste that is coming from shutdowns. So I would say yes, it depends on the organization, how you want to do it.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, it's a common observation that you tend to see, the shutdown is declared to be finished, and yet you go outside in the plant. Well, most of my familiarity is with processing plants, but the shutdown is declared to have been completed, and we've met the deadline, and we've come under budget. But you go outside into the field, and you see the field littered with leftover materials, used oil, packaging, you name it, and is then left for the teams that remain, that are back in production, to clear. So I think often that's what faults the shutdown process and the environmental aspects that come with it. But thank you for that.
Most welcome. Mm.
Okay. You want to say something? You can come up.
Yeah, we are waiting. I'm just reading through the comments here.
Okay, yeah. There's the one by Siabunga Makayesh saying, I hope you can comment on the needs for proactive planning for potential environmental opportunities and constraints before shutdown commences, and a guide as to what percentage of shutdown budget should be dedicated. Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
I guess Mr. Kadyamadare has highlighted it when he was presenting on the clauses of the ISO 45001. Planning is a very important aspect of the shutdowns with reference to the environmental aspects. So yeah, there's need for that proactive planning approach as highlighted. Thank you. And also Fungai was saying a good practice is to put a budget line item for the housekeeping aspect, especially after work is completed. The leftover aspect is usually clearing of used materials. That has been highlighted also. Okay. Is there anyone with another question, contribution, or who would like to add to this discussion from the participants, from the audience? Oh, you're free to speak up, guys. Yes, Mr. Marara, I can see your mic is on. You would want to say something?
Yeah, not much, Lord, but I just want to thank Tendai for a good presentation. And surely we now have to look at a big picture on the impact of environment. I think he highlighted some key areas. So I would like to commend him for that presentation. I actually, from my side, I picked some of the key things to learn. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks, Darlington.
Thank you, Mr. Darlington. This was a very insightful presentation from Mr. Kadyamadare. Usually, these environmental aspects, the impact of shutdowns, are usually overlooked. Many people focus on safety, on the safety aspects, preventing, eliminating hazards, preventing accidents, but the environmental aspect is usually overlooked. Mr. Mpunga, I heard your mic on. You wanted to say something? Fungai? Oh, I guess it was a mistake. So is there anyone else with another contribution?
Okay, Teach, sorry, I was just having some challenges there. I've got two more questions for you, Mr. Tendai. Now, when incidents tend to happen, the safety incidents, often you find there's an aspect of, say that we've had a spillage or a release of material. Now, the investigations tend to focus on the aspect of the injured person or damage to equipment. And I don't know, from your observations, what's the ranking of the environmental aspect?
All right. You said you had two questions. Do you want to throw the other one?
Let me gather my thoughts properly, and I'll ask after your response. Thank you.
All right. So I think what you have said, yeah, is critically important. When you have an environmental, or when you have an incident, it depends on the system that you use for reporting and investigating incidents. So a complete system will actually probe you when you report what kind of an incident is it. Because one incident might have multiple consequences, right? It might have safety consequences, it might have environmental, it might have asset related or asset damage consequences. So you need to identify those in advance. And before you even start to investigate, once you identify the nature of the incidents, is it an environmental issue? Is it a safety issue? Is it a process safety? Is it just asset damage? You need to risk assess it. So that will tell you where you want to prioritize. So the risk assessment matrix that you use, if it's for an environmental incident, for example, it will tell you the magnitude of the incident, so that you know what kind of effort you need to apply. Like I said, one incident might have multiple consequences. So when you risk assess, I think the outcome of the risk assessment will tell you that probably the safety aspect had more consequences or more severe consequences than the environmental one. But doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have to investigate it, because probably the potential for the environmental incident, which has less consequences, could have been higher. So you still need to investigate it based on the potential. That's why I always say, so if I'm talking from an auditor's perspective, for example, these are the kind of things that we look at. So when the incident happened, what were the actual consequences and what were the potential consequences? So was the potential investigated? And what were the outcomes? So yes, I get your point, but it's actually up to us as HSE professionals. This is what we need to be doing in organizations. We need to be guiding and advising leadership and process owners on how to investigate and how to come to a reasonable conclusion when we do investigations. It's actually our responsibility as well. So yes, it happens. I have seen it. You are right. It happens that people tend to focus more on what they are comfortable with and leave out those things that they think they are not comfortable with.
Thank you for that. And my second question was going to be around the incident response. Often it's, the environment itself doesn't create incidents, but you find in the process of executing work, you mentioned about effluent discharge or release of hard material into the atmosphere. I've had an experience where we released some serious quantities of acid that leaked out of a pipe. The work was not completed. The guys forgot to tighten up the bolts as part of the scope of work. And after startup, we released a lot, huge volumes of acid that spilled onto the external environment. But when I think back of the incident investigations, the environmental aspect, we understood that yes, we impacted the environment, but the immediate response What's your guidance around responding to such incidents?
From what I know, is that there are industry specific guidelines on how to respond, and sometimes it's also guided by the prevailing legislation in any country that you are operating from. So yes, firstly you need to check at what the legislation says. I know in Zimbabwe there is the Environmental Management Act, I think. In South Africa, they have the National Environmental Management Act, and in the rest of the world, they would have legislation that guides you on how to respond. But legislation alone is not adequate. So the organizations, that's why we need to have, the plans in place, because organizations, they also need to make sure that, the plans that they have on paper, they can, back them up when there's an incident. You might have a good plan, but if you don't have resources, it's not going to help. Resources could be internal, like when you have, like the one that you just mentioned, you could be having internal resources where you can go and actually stop the pollution before it goes further downstream. If you don't have, you might have to rely rely on external service providers like spill response companies. But I think like I say, the most important thing is to ensure that we stop further pollution, or we prevent further pollution. That's important. And then you can try to do the rest, but at least stop the damage before it goes further. I don't know the participants that are here, but I would like to think that a lot of organizations these days, they do have processes in place to manage such releases in terms of how to respond, and in terms of how to investigate, and in terms of how to mitigate the resulting impacts. So like again, I would say, yeah, theoretically speaking, yes, we have legislation, we have industry standards, and we have international standards that guide us. So it depends on the organization and where you are operating from.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kadyamadare. Oh, Mr. Mufunda, you have something to say?
No, thank you for that response. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mpunga. It was Mr. Mfunda. Our names tend to rhyme.
Yeah, they do.
And the clever one usually speaks first. So thank you. I think we have got a bigger challenge in terms of from the presentation that I have heard, and also the questions that have been put forth by Mr. Mpunga. We have a bigger challenge in terms of the environmental incidents. Precedence is taken over by the safety incidents. Why? Because of the relevant regulatory authorities. If you look at NASA, the way they push their statistics, the way they push their incidences is different from EMA. And that approach now, when you look at an incident, what comes first into your mind is the safety aspect. And you try and address it as quickly as possible. It has got guidelines, it has got deadlines, it has got penalties, it has got. So you look at where does the whip come first? Then you say after that, now the environmental incidents are more of the blind sides of the investigation. So people basically first look, if they look at lost time, they don't look at lost time incident, they look at lost time injury. They don't even look at the spillages that have occurred, the impact that has occurred from the spillages. So basically, from this, I think it's an eye opener from the training that we have had, and moving forward, we should also look into also the environmental issues and try and work on them, significantly putting effort so that we can get better results. I think there are a lot of environmental incidents that are going unattended for the sake of they don't have any penalty, they don't have any repercussion, they don't have any consequence. You can just put in your front end loader and scoop off and throw it away. No one will look at you. So I think maybe from what we have heard, I think it's very important that we also have that third eye that looks at the environmental incidents when we are also looking at the safety incidents, so that we do not only put effort on the safety, we also put effort on the environmental side of the incident. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr.
No, I was going to say thanks, Mr. Mfunda. That's very relevant. And I think if you remember when we started the presentation, there were questions that we posed there. Why should we be concerned? And we talked about moral obligations, duty of care, responsible care issues. So it would depend on the industry, really, because sometimes we find that we talked about legal obligations, but if the legal side of it is not that strong, some organizations may tend to take advantage. So it's entirely up to industry to raise the bar, because the regulatory authorities sometimes it's because they don't have enough resources to monitor and to apply consequence management. Sometimes, yes, they might be there, maybe competence issues, logistics issues, transport. So it's entirely up to industry to up the game. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Kadyamadare. Thank you, Mr. Mfunda. Just to add on what Mr. Mfunda was saying, even on the issue of emergency planning, the environmental aspects are not even considered. I'll give you one example from my experience. We had an acid leak, and the acid drained into, there was a spillage drainage pond that was there. But because that drainage has not been inspected or monitored or even maintained, there were cracks, so the acid then started leaching into the ground. So what I wanted to highlight there is that even during our mock drills, the environmental aspects are not usually considered. Because if we had been testing those spillage drainage ponds with water or something else during our mock drills, we would have noted that. But because during our emergency response plan, we are mainly focusing on the safety issues, first aid, and the likes, the environmental aspects is not considered. It tends to be overlooked. So we need to rethink our approaches to all these things, to all these aspects in our business, in our organizations. Is there anyone else with another contribution or with something to say? Yes, Mr.
Yeah,
Mara.
maybe just to round up, like what Tine was saying, it's now up to us to up the game. I know there may be some gaps from the legislation, but I think it also depends with the organizational commitment. I'll give an example where I'm working. Environment, I mean, we're very sensitive about that. Yeah, you actually, there's like a log sheet, like where you actually raise it online and it's captured as a tracker. So I think if we can have 10 like organization making that commitment, I think we can up the game. So I would say the boys on us, it's not too late, but we have to up the game and put this drive. I think you can all agree where we are going, even at industrial or at even on other than industrial environment is now becoming a very, very big like drive or concern. So we have to be very, very we have to be mindful of our environment. So it's up to us. It's not too late. Let's up the game, team. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Everyone needs to make sure that whenever we are implementing our management systems in every aspect of our business processes, we have to consider the environment in everything. Thank you, Mr. Marara. Is there anyone else who would like to add on or to ask a question? Let me check the charts. If there's anything else. Or there is Helen Wanji saying the aspect of waste management and pre-planning for the same was a new lesson for me. Thank you, Mr. Tendai. She's appreciating what she got from the presentation. Okay, yeah, others are just thanking you, Mr. Kadyamadare, for an insightful presentation. Is there anyone else with something to say? Okay, so yeah, thank you, Mr. Tendai, for that insightful presentation. I gave everyone has taken a few or all the points that has been highlighted in this discussion, and we will hope to implement them in our day-to-day businesses. They won't remain on this on the paper, like it was being said. So yeah, thank you, Mr. Kadyamadare.
Well, thank you very much for arranging this and for giving everyone the opportunity to participate in this discussion. We learn every day, regardless of who we are and what position we have in the industry. Every opportunity that we have to learn, we have to grab it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true. Learning doesn't cease. We have to keep on learning. We have to keep on imparting knowledge in ourselves. Thank you for that. So I guess that brings us to the end of our session. But before we leave, I would like to share with you something. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. Okay. So on the 25th of June, we launched our first issue of our first magazine in the esh.africa, and it's available free on our website. You can read it from there, or you can download it online, or then read it offline. So, and right now what I'm sharing you is right, that is the magazine. So it's esh.africa, or addressing the psychosocial hazards at the workplace. The month of May was a mental health awareness month, and also that's when we made our discussions on psychosocial risks at workplace. And in June, that's when the ISO 45001 was published, which is a driving force for managing psychosocial risks in our workplaces. So we are complementing that with this magazine. So there are a few articles on psychosocial risk at workplace, and we have a story of Rangarai Mangundu, who is one of the survivors of an accident. And in that article, where he was sharing about how he overcame all the adversity that came with the incident. So what I'm sharing with you is there is a QR code. So if you have you can just scan this QR code right now, and it will redirect you to the download page where you can access this magazine. Let me see if I can share also the link on the chat where you can just go and log into our esh.africa page to access this magazine. It's free, and there are a few articles that you can get knowledge from in that magazine. So thank you all for the support that you have been giving us, and I hope you read this magazine. Oh, sorry, I had a technical glitch. But I was talking about the magazine. Then for our next session, we are going to be having Mr. Darlington Mara as our guest presenter, and the topic will be on workplace economics, and it will be on the 16th of July. That will be our next session. Unfortunately, my host PC has been disconnected from the session, so I cannot share the flyer with you. But those who just joined this with their emails will get the flyer on their emails. So yeah, the session will be on workplace economics with Mr. Darlington Marara from Lafarge. So thank you everyone for participating in this session. Thank you all those who joined. I guess we had a great discussion on the environmental impact of shutdowns and how to manage those environmental aspects in our workplaces. I guess everyone has learned a lot. Thank you. For now, I think it's time to say goodbye, everyone.
All right, thanks. Bye. We meet in other sessions and other forums. Thank you.
Are we doing our
Thank
photo?
you.
Are we doing the photo, Teach?
Unfortunately, I'm no longer connected on the PC right now. I'm just connected on my phone. But you can take the screenshot. Everyone, you can turn on your camera, your video, so we can take a photo. You can turn on your camera so we can take a photo. Unfortunately, I cannot see if everyone is. Van, if everyone is switched on their camera, I think you can take a photo. On my end, I don't have that option.
So do we say cheese?
Cheers.
Nah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Bye. Bye,
Talk some
guys.
other time. Bye.
Thank you. See you next time. See you next on the 16th of July.
Thank you. What a
All
great
right.
session
In
we
another
have.
session.
Thank you.
Thank you.